The U.S. president in Japan this hour, the first stop of a long trip through Asia. Top of his agenda, the nuclear threat from North Korea. A power move in the Saudi royal family. A number of ministers detained or sacked on anti-corruption crackdowns, led by the crown prince. And a political vacuum in Lebanon. The prime minister of that nation resigns, saying he fears for his life. Live from CNN World Headquarters in Atlanta. Welcome to our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm George Howell. The CNN Newsroom starts right now. 4 a.m. on the U.S. East Coast. Good day to you. The U.S. president is in Japan today, the first leg of several stops during his trip throughout Asia. Mr. Trump met with that nation's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The two went to a country club near Tokyo to have lunch. Then they played a round of golf. Before that, though, the president spoke to American troops at Yokota Air Base. He didn't mention North Korea by name nor the nuclear threat that it poses, but his remarks were clear.
No one, no dictator, no regime, and no nation should underestimate ever American resolve. Every once in a while in the past, they underestimated us. It was not pleasant for them, was it? It was not pleasant. We will never yield, never waver, and never falter in defense of our people, our freedom, and our great American flag.
Let's go live to Tokyo for the latest. Alexandra Field following the story. Alexandra, good to have you with us this hour. What more can you tell us about the president's message?
Well, look, George, from the moment the president touched down on the first leg of this tour through Asia, it was important for him clearly to articulate the purpose of this trip, which will be to exact further cooperation from key partners in the region when it comes to countering that mounting threat from North Korea. And no, he did not need to say North Korea to the assembled troops whom he addressed in order to make his message clear, in order to send another warning to the regime. He said no regime, no dictator should underestimate the resolve of the United States. This will be a trip that is about trade, according to President Trump, but it is certainly about how to deal with North Korea and working with those key partners. Look, this administration has at times been disparaging of China, saying that they have not fully used their economic leverage over North Korea in order to rein in that rogue regime. They have also heaped some praise on China recently for going further in upholding the latest rounds of sanctions against North Korea. This is also an administration that has shown its solidarity with the people of South Korea, reaffirmed the importance of that alliance, but also criticized the leadership there for what the president has once termed as appeasement. So his closest ally in the region, especially when it comes to countering this threat from North Korea, is the one that he finds right here in Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The Trump administration continues to say that the policy is to enact and exact diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea, but we know that this is a president who also likes to remind the world that the United States has a military option that it could use should it need to use that option. He has a close ally in Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was recently re-elected with a strong show of support from the people here in Japan. These are two leaders who believe that Japan must continue to be able to expand its military's ability to protect and defend the people of Japan. And the threat from North Korea has literally hit close to home in recent weeks and months. It was this year, of course, that North Korea sent 2 missiles flying over the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. So look, this was a well-choreographed decision to start this trip here in Japan, where the president will have these talks over the next few days with his ally, Prime Minister Abe. They'll be talking, of course, about how to counter the ballistic missile threat from North Korea, the nuclear threat from North Korea, the cyber threats that we are increasingly seeing from North Korea, and developing this strategy for how to do that. This political partnership that's been forged between these two leaders, of course, is the underpinnings of what's really developed as a close personal friendship. These are two men who've had some 16 phone calls since President Trump took office. You saw the Prime Minister travel to the United States to visit President Trump twice. And now, of course, significant that President Trump is making the first stop in his Asia tour right here in Japan. He kicked it off with a round of golf with Prime Minister Abe. George?
Alexandra Field with reporting live for us in Tokyo. Thank you so much for that. Now let's get some context on the significance of this trip with Mike Chinoy. Mike, a senior fellow with the U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California, also the author of Meltdown, the inside story of North Korean nuclear crisis. And we also add that Mike spent many years as an international correspondent for CNN. Always a pleasure to have you here on this network, Mike. Let's talk a bit about this. We just heard from Alexandra a moment ago in the reporting. Shinzo Abe won another term clearly, a close ally of President Trump. So the question, how is President Trump perceived there in Japan?
I think the Japanese government and Prime Minister Abe made a conscious decision after President Trump took office that they were going to do everything they could to cultivate as warm a relationship with the new president as possible. That being said, the things that have raised questions about President Trump in many parts of the world, I think still resonate and still generate some concern among the Japanese. His proclivity for fiery rhetoric, the policy flips, and all the other controversies. But Abe has gone out of his way to try and forge a personal relationship because I think this is a very conscious calculation. It's not just warm and fuzzy vibes here, that the Japanese can see their own interests better advanced if Abe has a really warm relationship with the American president rather than a more standoffish one.
Let's talk a bit more about that relationship between these two leaders. What is it that connects them really? Beyond the obvious alliance against North Korea, what is the net positive for Japan with a close relationship connection to President Trump?
Well, there are very important economic ties, and also the U.S. has a formal treaty alliance to support Japan. There are American military bases in Japan. Abe has been a strong proponent of strengthening the Japanese military, and so he has been, to some degree, pleased to see President Trump taking such a harsh line on North Korea, because with tensions rising in the region and concern about North Korea growing, it gives him an excuse or more justification to try and push forward the policies to strengthen Japan's own military position. Also, the Japanese are in this complicated relationship with China because they're both very close economic partners, but to some degree strategic rivals. And in that setting, it's important for Japan to maintain and strengthen the alliance with the U.S., and Abe has clearly calculated that a close personal relationship with President Trump is one way to do that.
From President Trump's frustration regarding trade issues throughout the region to his desire to obviously garner deeper support on the front of North Korea, there have been mixed messages, to say the least. How are regional leaders looking to get clarity given this trip?
I think there is a tremendous desire in the region for some clarity on the part of the United States. The messages from the Trump administration on North Korea in particular have been very, very mixed. You have the president's very tough rhetoric, the belittling, the personal insults targeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, calling him Rocket Man, the threats to destroy North Korea made in his speech at the United Nations. And you also have the National Security Advisor, McMaster, talking about how deterrence doesn't work with North Korea and implying, therefore, that there's no real room for negotiations. At the same time, you have Secretary of State Tillerson repeatedly indicating an interest in trying to find a diplomatic way out, and that's a view that's been echoed by Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. So I think in the region, leaders are going to be very eager to try and get from this trip some better sense of where Trump is trying to go, whether all the threats mean that there really is a serious risk the U.S. may take preemptive military action, whether that's just bluster designed to exert pressure, and if so, where, if at all, is there any room for diplomacy to try and find an exit ramp to the North Korean nuclear issue?
One last question. So Japan, certainly friendly territory for President Trump, but moving forward to South Korea, moving on to China, do you expect this president to see a bit more scrutiny with regards to getting clarity on these issues?
Well, there's no question that with Prime Minister Abe, the personal vibes and the overall relationship are particularly warm. It won't be the same in South Korea. The U.S.-South Korea alliance is absolutely crucial, but the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, has long been a proponent of engagement, dialogue, negotiations with North Korea. He's been visibly uncomfortable, having been pushed by the circumstances into taking a tougher line, partly in response to North Korean behavior, and partly also because he doesn't want to have an open breach with President Trump. The South Koreans are very sensitive of comparing their own relationship with the U.S. relationship with Japan, and it will have not gone unnoticed in Seoul that President Trump is spending 48 hours in Japan, but only 24 hours in South Korea, and that there isn't the same kind of personal warmth. I think the South Korean president is going to try, while reaffirming the importance of the alliance, to make clear to President Trump that South Korea will want and insist upon a say in any American decision to take military action, because the South Koreans know that they will be in the front line if any kind of armed conflict erupts.
Mike Chinoy, live for us in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for the perspective this day. The U.S. President and the Japanese Prime Minister shared a moment that they showcased a bromance, you could call it, their close ties together. Take a look. When Mr. Trump landed, Mr. Abe surprised him with a customized baseball hat. How about that? White caps that have gold lettering that say, "Donald and Shinzo make alliance even greater." It's an obvious nod to Mr. Trump's well-known campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." The two leaders signed a few hats before hitting the greens for a round of golf. Looking now beyond Japan, here are some of the other stops on what will be the longest trip in Asia for a U.S. president since 1992. Up next, Mr. Trump heads to South Korea. He is expected to have bilateral and expanded meetings there. Then it's off to China. In Beijing, Mr. Trump will tour the Forbidden City with President Xi Jinping, with meetings scheduled for the next day. He then heads to Vietnam for the APEC summit events and makes his final stop in Manila for ASEAN meetings in the East Asia Summit. Mr. Trump told reporters that he believes that he will also meet with the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, during his trip. The White House says North Korea will be the primary topic of that conversation, that meeting likely to happen at the APEC summit in Vietnam. This, of course, comes as the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. election heats up back here in the United States. CNN's Jim Acosta has more now on the potential impact of a meeting between these two world leaders.
When you finally see President Trump and Vladimir Putin come face to face, that image is going to reverberate around the world, because obviously these are two men who, you don't hear President Trump talking about Vladimir Putin a great deal. And one of the criticisms of President Trump that's come up time and again is that he just doesn't criticize Vladimir Putin very much. And that's always been treated as somewhat of a curiosity ever since Donald Trump was a candidate for president and now that he's been in office. And because of the Russia investigation that is really ramping up back in Washington, this issue of Russia is going to be hanging over this president throughout this foreign trip. And just to see those two leaders together, I think, is going to make a great deal of news and just be fascinating to watch because of that undercurrent that is really just a part of this administration day in and day out.
Jim Acosta in Tokyo, and of course we will continue to follow the president's trip throughout Asia. Still ahead, it could be another step in a reformation of Saudi Arabia. The king has begun a crackdown on corruption starting at the very top. Details coming up. Plus, the relative stability of Lebanon is at risk after its prime minister surprisingly calls it quits. Ahead, why experts are pointing the finger at Iran and Saudi Arabia. In Yemen, security officials say a suicide bomber attacked the government's security headquarters. This happened in Aden, and the attack sparked clashes between security forces and suspected terrorists. Officials say the attacker rammed the vehicle rigged with explosives into the entrance gate of the headquarters. It's still unclear how many people died as a result of the blast. Since that attack happened less than a day after Houthi rebels in Yemen fired a missile at Saudi Arabia's capital city, the Saudi defense system intercepted the missile near the airport in Riyadh. No one was injured, but it did prompt a Saudi airstrike on Sana'a in Yemen. A lot to talk about here, and with us this hour, John Defterios on the story. John is our emerging markets editor and has covered Saudi Arabia for many years, live for us in Abu Dhabi. John, good to have you with us. In this conflict, this ongoing conflict, is there a sense now that Saudi Arabia could be targeted more? Are the Houthis gaining sophistication and abilities here to strike Saudi Arabia?
I think less on sophistication, although there's some dispute, George, about the backing from Tehran and whether they're providing the missile technology that we saw launched against Riyadh. It was an audacious attempt, of course, to go after the Saudi capital. So, yes, indeed, it takes this conflict into a new realm. That missile attack was intercepted by a Patriot missile. This was disputed by Yemeni officials overnight, but there were no casualties and no real damage, although debris was spread east of the King Khalid International Airport. So it did indeed raise some alarm. I think we have to put it in the broader context of what's taking place in this proxy war with Yemen, with backing of Tehran. We have Saudi Arabia leading a coalition which has the UAE involved. The Crown Prince, since he took over in that position last spring, doubled down on the effort here to mark a line in the sand and also restrict the movements of Iran. That's the goal here, whether it's in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. We see the resignation of Saad Hariri, the prime minister of Lebanon, overnight. They are directly related. He's worried about his life and because of the influence of Iran on Lebanese affairs as well. In the bigger context of the Crown Prince, of course, he's 32 years old. He wants to take a very tough line against Iran. He's choosing the battlefield of Yemen, which has become a humanitarian crisis. But instead of backing down, he's pushing ahead. We had an off-the-record briefing with him 10 days ago at a major investment summit in Riyadh, and he made it very clear in that meeting and with other officials that I'm talking to in Riyadh that they don't intend to back off the pedal, but in fact push ahead with this proxy war, which is becoming quite nasty and something that escalated overnight with no fewer than 20 attacks, rocket attacks on Sana'a as a result of that attempt in Riyadh.
John, I'll ask you to stand by for a moment. There's another story we'd like your input on that we're following out of Saudi Arabia regarding the anti-corruption committee that King Salman has created. This committee, it's already cost several top ministers their jobs, and CNN has also learned multiple princes, ministers, and former ministers have been detained. So, John, this committee created to target corruption, but does it in effect go beyond that? Could this be a means to consolidate power as well?
I think that's part of the equation, George. Many eyebrows were raised because the anti-corruption committee that he formulated over the weekend came down like a hammer overnight. You mentioned the outlines of it. We're looking at least 11 princes. The most prominent is Prince Mitteb, who is the head of the National Guard and had a ministerial ranking. We had 4 sitting ministers overall, better than a dozen former ministers, and extremely prominent businessmen, which I'll get to in a moment. But I think we should roll back the clock when the Crown Prince took that position, moving from Deputy Crown Prince circulated widely. He's the chairman of Kingdom Holdings. We probably know him internationally as a man worth better than $20 billion, an investor in Apple, an investor in Twitter, an investor in News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, Citigroup, scores of others. His stock is down in trading on Sunday in Riyadh by better than 10%. Bakr bin Laden, this is the older brother of Osama bin Laden, running a huge construction group in Saudi Arabia. Together with Prince Al-Walid, they're building the Kingdom Tower, which will be the tallest in the world, better than 1 kilometer high. Some question marks, of course, raised about financing in the future. Another prominent name for the international business community, Asif al-Assad, is the former Minister of Finance and Minister of State, somebody who took Saudi Arabia into the G20 a few years back and respected within the IMF World Bank community, the former Minister of Investment, another big trading family of Saudi Arabia, even an elderly billionaire, Saleh Al-Kamel, that people don't know outside the Middle East, but very prominent into Saudi Arabia. So I would break this down into 4 categories, which I think sums up your point here, George. First and foremost, the Vision 2030 to overhaul the economy and move beyond oil, perhaps root out construction, modernize the economy. Getting women to drive is a big move in June 2018, but also a different interpretation of Islam. The corruption probe, but to the last point that you were making, an ability to consolidate power. And I think underlining this is targeting those related to either directly by blood, but also in the business community to King Abdullah, who passed in 2015. This is a tribal society, and consolidating power is all part of the bill when we see a change at the top. King Salman and his Crown Prince son, 32-year-old Mohammed bin Salman, taking bold moves over the weekend.
And as he said in that clip that you played a moment ago, no one will be spared from this. John Defterios, live for us in Abu Dhabi, thank you so much for the reporting today. Back here in the United States, the New York Marathon is set to start in the coming hours, and the city is already boosting its security in order to be ready. Police are sending out helicopter patrols, they're sending out snipers and bomb-sniffing dogs. They'll also line the streets with blocking trucks, this to protect against vehicle attacks. The marathon is set to go ahead just days after a terrorist plowed a truck into pedestrians in Manhattan. That attack killing 8 people, injuring dozens of others. The governor of the state says they are not taking any chances.
There will be 2 or 3 times as many people deployed. As you heard from the commissioner, you'll have thousands of officers on duty this weekend. But I want to stress this is just a precautionary measure. We have no information that points to any issues. This is just a precautionary measure given the recent events.
ISIS has claimed the suspect in the New York City attack is a soldier of the caliphate. We're learning much more about the 29-year-old Uzbek national who authorities say drove a pickup truck on a mile-long killing spree. CNN's Brian Todd explains how the lone wolf terror suspect might have become radicalized.
Before he slaughtered 8 people and got out of his rented truck yelling Allahu Akbar, Sayfullo Saipov was not on any terror watch lists, officials say, and not the direct subject of any New York police or FBI investigations. But they say Saipov was likely connected to individuals who were the subjects of investigations, and they offer another clue.
He was associated with ISIS, and he was radicalized domestically.
Officials say Saipov has lived in Ohio, Florida, and Paterson, New Jersey. They aren't yet saying how or when Saipov was radicalized in the U.S.
What's your best take on how he was radicalized?
In many cases, it's a combination of online and offline radicalization. People start hanging out with like-minded individuals, people who embrace ISIS ideology, and then they go online to sort of reinforce their nascent jihadist views. In many cases, people radicalize because they have some personal issues, whether it could be, family problems or, job problems.
Expert Lorenzo Vedino says the process of becoming radicalized means spending a lot of time online.
Now it's apps like Telegram, like others that are very easy to download on your phone. They're mostly encrypted, and you can get all sorts of information. You can interact with other people. You can reinforce your ideological commitment to ISIS. You can get operational instructions.
And officials believe Saipov had close familiarity with operational instructions.
He appears to have followed almost exactly to a T the instructions that ISIS has put out in its social media channels before, with instructions to their followers on how to carry out such an attack.
One of the most popular instruction manuals Saipov might have read online, this one in the ISIS magazine Rumiyah last year. It discusses how to use rental trucks to attack crowds and inflict maximum casualties. Quote, vehicles are like knives, it says, and it urges attackers to announce their allegiance to the terror group. Quote, an example of such would be simply writing on dozens of sheets of paper, the Islamic State will remain. Very similar to a note officials say Saipov left in his vehicle.
The gist of the note was that the Islamic State would endure forever.
For ISIS, experts say, lone wolves offer an easier way to strike at soft targets without the extensive planning and skill used in attacks like Paris.
It doesn't have multiple pieces. You're not dealing with multiple cells or multiple people that you have to coordinate with. You just have to make sure that your target is one that is penetrable.
A key question now, how can authorities stop people from becoming radicalized? Terrorism experts say that's incredibly difficult. It requires police and intelligence services to get into communities, to establish networks of families and neighborhood leaders to watch for signs of young people becoming radicalized and get to them before they are. But most law enforcement agencies, experts say, simply don't have the resources to move that far into communities. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
Brian Todd, thanks for the reporting. Still ahead here on Newsroom, uncertainty in Lebanon. That nation's prime minister has quit. Next, why his surprise move could fuel sectarian tensions there. CNN Live from Atlanta, Georgia this hour, broadcasting on CNN USA here in the States and CNN International worldwide. Stay with us. Welcome back to our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. You're watching CNN Newsroom. It is good to have you with us. I'm George Howell with the headlines we're following for you this hour. The U.S. President Donald Trump is now in Japan, the first stop on a nearly 2-week-long tour of Asia. Soon after his arrival, Mr. Trump went to a country club near Tokyo. He had lunch and played golf with the Japanese Prime Minister. The president next travels to South Korea. King Salman has created an anti-corruption committee. It's already cost several top ministers their jobs. CNN also learning multiple princes, ministers, and former ministers have been detained. In the meantime, Saudi Arabia says it has intercepted a missile aimed at the airport in Riyadh. The Saudi Defense Ministry blames Houthi rebels in Yemen for the attack on Saturday, which it says did not injure anyone. In response, Saudi Arabia launched an airstrike on Sana'a, which is Yemen's capital. Lebanon is a symbol of relative stability in the Middle East, but now that country is facing a political vacuum which could fuel sectarian tensions. The prime minister has resigned, saying that he now fears for his life. He's Lebanon's most influential Sunni politician. CNN's Gul Tuzuz has more now from Turkey.
Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri announcing his resignation in a forceful speech that he issued from Saudi Arabia. And in that speech, he laid the blame for disunity not just in his country of Lebanon, but across the region on Iran and the Iranian-backed forces, specifically Hezbollah, saying that they have been having a detrimental effect on Lebanon as well as other countries in the Middle East, specifically Arab countries. Take a listen to what he said.
I want to say to Iran and its followers that they are losing in their interference in the affairs of the Arab world. Our nation will rise up as it had done in the past and cut off the hands that wickedly extend into it.
Hariri coming out and saying that Iran will pay a price for its meddling in Arab affairs and internal affairs of Lebanon as well. Iranian officials coming out just a couple of hours later saying that the allegations put forth by Hariri are unfounded and baseless. All of this just goes to show you how volatile the region is politically as Saudi Arabia and Iran continue to engage in power plays across the region. Gul Tuzuz, CNN, Istanbul.
Certainly a lot happening in the region that we'll continue to follow. Still ahead here, 2 former U.S. presidents with some choice words about the current commander-in-chief. A lot of stories we're following out of the Middle East. The prime minister of Lebanon resigning, leaving a political vacuum in that nation. Also, Saudi Arabia shooting down a missile attack from Yemen. Let's now bring in Fawaz Georges, the chair of contemporary Middle East studies at the London School of Economics, also the author of ISIS, A History, live in our London newsroom this hour. It's good to have you with us, Fawaz. The former prime minister pointing to Iran and Hezbollah as its proxy in Lebanon, fueling greater instability, he says, to the point where he could no longer lead. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I think, George, now Lebanon is in the eye of the storm. The resignation of Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri is really a political earthquake. Keep in mind that Saad al-Hariri played a pivotal role in the formation of government at the end of 2016. Lebanon was without a government for 2 years before Saad al-Hariri came to Lebanon and reached basically kind of reconciliation with the other political rivals in Lebanon. He is a moderate political nationalist. He basically, my take on it is that he has reached the end of his patience. The political costs to Saad al-Hariri outweighed any benefits from staying in the government, and that's why he resigned. The political situation and the social situation in Lebanon now is extremely, extremely serious.
With Yemen launching a missile into Saudi Arabia, is there a concern now that Saudi Arabia could be targeted with greater precision now?
You know, what we have witnessed, George, in the past few weeks is that the Houthi movement that controls the government in Sana'a in Yemen has been firing more and more missiles on Saudi Arabia. This is the first ballistic missiles that almost reached the capital of Saudi Arabia. I mean, almost 600 kilometers. So yes, there is a major escalation, and this will have tremendous implications on the situation in Yemen itself, because Saudi Arabia now feels extremely the urge to retaliate against the Houthi movement that controls the government in Sana'a.
And what we're seeing again is that proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran continue to heat up, essentially.
I think you're absolutely correct. We are seeing now the reverberations of geostrategic rivalries throughout the Middle East. In Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon. What Saudi Arabia is trying to do, George, is to counterbalance the spread of Iranian influence in the region. Saudi Arabia has become more muscular, it has become more active, it's leading from the front as opposed from the behind. Whether you're talking about Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen, my take on it is that the next few months are going to be extremely dangerous throughout the region, because the geostrategic rivalries are intensifying, and what has happened in Lebanon in the past 48 hours tells me that we're going to see more tensions, not only in Syria and Iraq, but even in Lebanon and other places as well. I mean, I think the end of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, does not really mean the end of geostrategic struggles. On the contrary, the dismantling of the so-called physical caliphate will basically intensify the geostrategic struggles between the pro-Iranian camp led by Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and of course Saudi Arabia and its allies in the region, including the United States.
Fawaz, I also want to ask you about the situation in Saudi Arabia, the anti-corruption committee that King Salman has created. As we reported a moment ago, several princes, ministers, former ministers have been detained. A two-part question here. Is this mainly about cracking down on corruption? And secondly, is there a sense that this is a move to consolidate power?
I think these two questions, George, are interrelated to each other. What we are seeing in Saudi Arabia, my own take, we are seeing the birth of a new order. The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is not only consolidating his power, but also laying out his vision for the kingdom and putting his vision into practice. So many people in the past 2 or 3 years really have underestimated the ability of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman not only to consolidate his power, but to structure state and the economy. And everything that's happening in the past year or so in Saudi Arabia tells me that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is really putting his basically ideas into practice and cracking down not only against oppositional figures in the kingdom, but basically trying to prevent, as he said a few days ago, the bleeding of the economy and also the migration of resources from Saudi Arabia into other countries. The question is now, really Saudi Arabia is in transition, is undergoing a major transition. It's going to take a while for this new order to basically become very established and very clear.
Fawaz Gerges, we always appreciate your perspective live for us in our London bureau. Thank you.
Thank you.
For former presidents, it is a golden rule, maintaining a code of silence when it comes to your successors. But in a brand new book, both former presidents, Bush, are letting loose about the U.S. President Donald Trump and the party that he now leads. CNN special correspondent Jamie Gangel sat down with the author of The Last Republicans for this exclusive interview.
Former President Bush, 43, told you when Trump entered the race, he thought
interesting, won't last.
Won't last.
Won't last. But when Trump started to rise, I think he became concerned because he saw this populism of Donald Trump getting in the way of America's position in the world.
He gave you rare insight, though, into his criticism of Donald Trump. What did he tell you?
One of the things he said was that one of the hallmarks of great leadership is humility. So when Donald Trump said, "I am my own advisor," Bush thought, and this is a quote, "Wow, this guy doesn't know what it means to be president."
What was his tone when he talked to you about Trump?
I think it was restrained. The Bushes are very restrained. And I also think that they realize they have a role to play as former presidents. And they have to be restrained. They have to be dignified.
He weighed his words.
I think he did, yes.
President Bush 41 was a bit blunter. He said that he thought Donald Trump had, quote, a certain ego. And then he told you point blank,
he's a blowhard. He's a blowhard. I don't like him, plain and simple. And I'm not excited about him being a leader, was his quote. And if you look at the Bush family, it makes perfect sense. Donald Trump is everything that the Bush family is not. George Bush grew up thinking about the greater good. Donald Trump, I think, is manifestly narcissistic. It's part of his brand. And that brand is the antithesis of the Bush brand.
How do you think these two men feel that Donald Trump is now the standard bearer of the Republican Party?
I think it's pretty clear if you look at their records and their views politically that, I'm going to quote George H.W. Bush, they're not excited about Donald Trump being our leader. That's not a leap of faith. That's pretty clear. And I think the most clear demonstration we get of that recently is Charlottesville. The Bushes came out with a joint tweet, which they had never done in the past, condemning bigotry and anti-Semitism and all the things that were on display in Charlottesville among the white supremacists. That was a clear betrayal of American values, and the Bushes came out with that joint statement. I think that spoke resoundingly about the void in leadership that they were seeing from the White House.
There are a lot of quotes from the Bushes that are going to make news in this book. Bush 43 talks about whether Vice President Dick Cheney had played an outsized role in his presidency, something that gets talked about all the time. Was Dick Cheney too powerful? And Bush 43 told you?
Well, he was talking about the neoconservatives in general, and specifically about Cheney and Rumsfeld. And he said, and I quote, Cheney and Rumsfeld never made one decision.
That's the quote.
That's the quote. I understand his frustration because at the time there was the perception that Dick Cheney was the acting president. But in fact, George W. Bush had had a lifetime of making bold decisions. He has this preternatural confidence in himself as a leader. And if you talk to those around him, they have confidence in his leadership. And so this notion that Cheney was making the decisions is ludicrous.
When you started to write this book, let me guess, the title was not The Last Republicans.
When I set out to write this in 2013, it was a very different time. But The Last Republicans became the right title during what has become the Trump era.
Because?
Well, George W. Bush himself said in 2016, privately, and to me, I fear that I'll be the last Republican president.
He confirmed that to you.
He confirmed that to me. And it wasn't just about Hillary Clinton becoming president. It was because Donald Trump represented everything that the Bushes abhorred.
Our thanks to Jamie Gangel for that interview. In response to the comments, a White House official told CNN the following: if one presidential candidate can disassemble a political party, it speaks volumes about how strong a legacy its past two presidents really had. And that begins with the Iraq War, one of the greatest foreign policy mistakes in American history.